close your eyes. Think about a time you snapped at someone. What was going on with you that day in that point of your life? Were you stressed, grieving, under the weather, feeling insecure or emotionally wounded, doubting yourself? Now think about a time you said, either verbally or internally, "That's not my job." Maybe it's happened right here in this building. You show up on a Sunday morning and they need another usher. You've already ushered 3 times this month. It's not your job. Okay, keep your eyes closed. Now do the reverse. Think about a time someone snapped at you. What did you do? How did you respond? And think about a time someone told you, "That's not my job," when you really were desperate for help. Okay, you can open your eyes. The story that Kate read for us this morning is a tough one to hear. In fact, I told Kate I almost skipped right over it to the Old Testament passage for this morning because I didn't want to preach this kind of Jesus. We like to think of the Rosa Parks type Jesus, staging nonviolent protests against the powers that be. We like to think of the Jesus who patiently and lovingly sat with children and prostitutes, tax collectors, invalids and outcasts, listening to their stories. We like to think of Good Samaritan Jesus. But we don't get Good Samaritan Jesus in this morning's reading. At least, at first glance, it appears we get racist jerk Jesus, for lack of a better word. So what do we do with an uncomfortable story like this? What do we do with a Jesus who behaves a little too human for comfort? Well, one thing we could do is just completely throw out the story. Certainly, biblical historians have questioned whether this is a legitimate story about Jesus, or whether it was added later by editors and scribes, people in the early church who didn't really like Paul's message about the good news being for everyone, even Gentiles and foreigners, and wanted a story that would back up their prejudice. That's one option. But what if we do allow for the possibility that this is a legitimate story about Jesus? That Jesus did really call someone a dog. Not someone in power, but someone helpless and asking for his help. What if we allow for the possibility that Jesus refused to serve someone because of her race? Because he didn't think God had called him to help her. What then do we do at this social justice-minded church with a scene like this? Well, I often find it helpful with difficult and troubling texts in the Bible to step back for a moment, to zoom out the lens. Only a chapter ago, Jesus was back in his hometown, teaching and healing as he had done everywhere else. His own family and friends and neighbors didn't get it. They didn't get him. They think he's wise, but they know his credentials are a little iffy. Jesus hasn't studied under a rabbi as other rabbis have. He is the son of that carpenter up the road, isn't he? He spent his days sanding wood and building furniture, didn't he? What right does he have to teach in the synagogue or the temple? They think he's a fake, an imposter rabbi. They take offense at him, reject his mission, his sense of calling. Now, this wasn't the first time that Jesus was rejected, and it certainly wasn't the last. But as we all know, it's the rejection of the people who are closest to us, the people who are supposed to love us, that hurts the most. Certainly it must have rattled him a bit. And then something else happened that definitely rattled him. We don't often think of Jesus as having his own rabbi, his own spiritual guide. But if anyone were to fit that bill, it would have been his cousin, John the Baptist. After all, Jesus came to John and asked him to baptize him. Well, zooming back the lens from this morning's story, not long before this encounter with this woman, Jesus got very troubling news. John is dead. And not just dead, but executed. Made a spectacle, a mockery. His head disgustingly put on display at Herod's party. Understandably, Jesus is quite shaken up by this. He tries to get away, find some time to himself to grieve. Perhaps to shake his fist and ask God, why? Or maybe just to hide. Certainly the authorities coming after John doesn't bode well for Jesus' own future. He wants time, solitude, peace, retreat, refuge, sanctuary. Instead, as often happens when we are grieving, life just keeps chugging along. And he hardly has a minute to himself before people start to come to him, needing to be healed. So he throws himself into his work, as many of us do when we're grieving. He heals and heals, and he isn't even planning to take a break to eat until his disciples come up to him and remind him that he's not the only one who needs to eat, but also these 5,000 who have followed him out into the middle of nowhere. So he stops, and the crowd shares what little food they've brought with them, and somehow it's enough. Finally, as the day closes, Jesus sends his disciples on ahead of him across the Sea of Galilee. They get in the boat, but when Jesus goes to meet them, not one of them believes it is actually him and not a ghost coming across the water. Jesus is yet again reminded that even those who are the very closest to him, these disciples, his students, his friends, they still don't get him. Finally, they get to the other side of the lake, and Jesus might as well have walked into a courtroom for the interrogation he receives from the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious leaders who held an amazing amount of power. As we can tell from Jesus' exasperated conversation with them, they definitely don't get his message. They don't understand what he's trying to tell them. They are threatening his life, his ministry. So that's what we see when we put the wide-angle lens on this story. We see a rejected Jesus. We see a kicked out of his home Jesus. We see a grief-stricken Jesus. We see a fearful for his life Jesus. We see an overworked, exhausted Jesus trying to meet the never-ending needs. We see a Jesus who feels misunderstood and unseen. It's the kind of thing that happens to us from time to time. Everything colliding in on us all at once. We feel like we're living at the edge, just getting by from moment to moment. All of our survival instincts usually make us want to pull inward, pull back, pull away. We want to draw some clearly defined limits and boundaries around ourselves. Keep ourselves safe, protected, make things manageable. There are times when we're worn thin, so thin that when someone even so much as rubs against those clearly defined limits we've set, it feels like they're rubbing us raw. It may have been this kind of thing that happened with Robin Williams this week. possible for him to have an end of his rope? Doesn't he always respond thoughtfully and lovingly? I believe what we see here is Jesus' full humanity showing through. As I said earlier, in cases like this, sometimes Jesus is just a little too human for comfort. I don't believe Jesus meant to be malicious toward this woman. When we feel like we have very little bandwidth left, we tend to draw boundaries. And it is very, very human to draw those boundaries along false lines of prejudice and race and difference, to not even realize that those are misconceived human lines and not the lines of God. It is easy to use language of hate that is present in our culture without even realizing it, without recognizing that that's not the language of God. The term that Jesus used for this woman, a domestic dog, was a very common term to refer to Gentiles in his day. Barbara Brown Taylor suggests that this is the turning point in Jesus' ministry. Just as our sense of call from God develops over time, so does Jesus' own sense of calling and mission. Like many of us, he hears God's still speaking voice in surprising places from surprising people. In our lens this morning, he doesn't hear it from the disciples. He doesn't hear it from the authorities, either religious or civic. He doesn't hear it from his family and friends in his hometown. He can no longer hear it from the person he most respected, John. Instead, he hears it from a Gentile woman, one he was ready to quickly reject. What marvelous ways God speaks to us. Something in this encounter with her snaps Jesus out of his stressed, tired, grieving, frustrated fog. It appears to be the moment that this woman gets right up in his face and says, "Lord, have mercy." Unlike everyone else, she gets it. She sees in him God's calling and mission. She recognizes what he is about, what he is called to be. As with so many mothers who are trying to protect their children, she is brave, she is bold, and she is determined. And it is her quick wit that gets through to Jesus. Somehow, her instincts tell her to push the limits, to push Jesus' limits. She knows who he's called to be. She knows that his mission is larger than those limits he has drawn for self-preservation. She knows that he is capable of much more than he thinks he is. She knows that Jesus is capable of transcending the deeply entrenched cultural prejudice and barriers of her day. She knows those barriers are not of God. As I think of the many conflicts in our world and in our country, so many of them are racially charged. So many involve barriers and boundaries and limits. It is children crossing our border. It is police shields and wands and Ferguson. It is the many unarmed black men and boys shot rather than arrested. It is a pastor who cancels a man's funeral in Tampa the night before it was scheduled after learning that he had a husband. It is a wall in Gaza. It is the boundaries of the Yazidi refugee camps in Iraq. It is Christians in so many places being forced to convert or face death. It is food bans in Russia. It is the conflicts in Syria and Pakistan and in Ukraine. So many of our conversations about how to handle these issues and conflicts come down to discussions of bandwidth. How much can we handle? Come down to our self-preservation, our self-protection. And when we are feeling tired, worn, overwhelmed, misunderstood, fearful, or filled with grief, as we often are, these issues or conflicts, or even many of the smaller ones in our own personal lives, in those cases, it's easy to dig in the trenches even deeper, to build the walls even higher. We need voices in these places, bold voices, like the woman we read about this morning, who are willing to push the limits. We need people who are in touch with the still speaking God, who can say, I see you. I get you. I know you are capable of far more than you think. I know that each of us here this morning is capable of being those bold, peacemaking, pushing the limits voices. I know that each of us is capable of engaging in the mission which Jesus realized during this conversation with this woman. A mission of tearing down dividing walls of hostility, of letting God's Spirit, wild and free, spread wherever it will. May God work through us as we speak and act. May God speak to us when we are feeling worn and raw. May God always challenge us to step out of our us-domes and into the kingdom. That is the work and the substance of faith.